Welcome to my review of Splatterhouse 3 for the Sega Genesis. This game has unlimited continues and passwords. So usually when you get to a new stage, it's best to commit suicide and start the stage from the beginning with the full lives. It's usually faster. But there are a few stages that you're probably going to have to practice and learn anyway, and I recommend using save and load states to practice sections that may be giving you trouble. Now the game does have a timer mechanic where you're expected to beat sections fast to get a good ending, which I didn't give a shit about because honestly the game, for me, I find it to be a very irritating game and I don't really like the way it's designed, and I'm going to get into that. But this is another game by Namco, and I love Splatterhouse 1 and 2. They're two of my favorite games on their respective platforms. You know, I love both games. And I did tutorials for both on the channel as well with commentary, so check those out if you're interested. But I remember before this game came out, I remember seeing it in magazines, and you know I was skeptical because I saw that they were changing it into a Streets of Rage style beat 'em up. The original game, Splatterhouse 1 and 2, are games where you move on a single platform. You know, there is no up and down movement. You only move left to right, kind of like Kung Fu, but you know, not that simple. But that same kind of like similar linear kind of gameplay where you can't move up and down. There was also there were a few that had diverging paths, but it was basically just left and right movement. And there was a great rhythm to those games where enemies usually took one or two hits to take out, but you had to get your movement down and really find the pacing and rhythm of each level. Now, so that was totally removed when they made this like a Streets of Rage style beat 'em up game. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it would have been fine if they made it actually into a good beat 'em up. You know what I mean? But unfortunately, this game, you know, it has a decent variety of enemies. You know, not a great variety, but it's okay. But the biggest problem is that it's just very inconsistent. I mean, you can be comboing an enemy as you would in most beat 'em ups, and enemies just break through your combos randomly, it seems. The other thing is you have bosses like this that are super fucking annoying just to hit and land hits on. And that's what a lot of the game is about, is just trying to fucking irritate you with just cheap bullshit, you know, where the enemies just throw out this little bullshit at you and you have to try to, you know, get them, and they're constantly running away. And this is one of the worst examples of that in the game. It's just very irritating. Now you can transform into your Super Rick form. When you press A, you will, if you have that POW meter filled up, that white meter on the bottom left, it says POW, that's your transformation meter. And you get orbs in the environment to fill that back up. And you can use that whenever you have any charge in there. And it's useful to use it often because you do a lot more damage. Now you see that spin kick I did. There are special moves, but they're a real pain in the ass to do. To do that move, you have to press forward, back, forward. And it has to be done, of course, you know, depending which way you're facing. But you have to do that and then hit strike, and you have to, you know, try to do that while enemies are swarming you. And it's a pain in the ass to do those inputs. But that is the key to mastering the game. It's that simple. You just have to spam, you know, the special moves. So if you really want to destroy the game in fast time, you pretty much have to spam those moves. It's too slow to fight the enemies normally. So you're forced, you know, if you play the game the way the game wants you to play it within the time limit, you're pretty much forced to spam pretty much only special moves. So you would be just spin kicking the whole time. Or better yet, as Super Rick, if you do that move and add an extra input, I think it's back, forward. It's an extra input, and then punch, which is even harder to do. If you spam that, you'll do massive damage. And that's kind of the key to speeding through the game. So it's kind of a shitty way to beat a game. I mean, it's stupid that you have to spam one move to try to make the timer. The game is also just really irritating, like I said, with enemies getting in cheap shots when you're in the middle of a combo. They just break through kind of randomly. Most of the bosses are just enemies that will just run away from you constantly, and you have to try to hit them, and they just do cheap attacks. Also, pretty much every time you get hit, you get knocked onto the ground, and it takes a moment to stand back up. Pretty much every fucking time you get hit. It's extremely fucking annoying, to say the least. I found myself taking a break from the game when I got to the semifinal stage because I just didn't really want to deal with it anymore. Just, not that it was super hard, it was just so fucking irritating to me. The game would really irritate me because, you know, every time you get knocked down, you got to wait to get back up. The enemies do massive damage to you, of course, as well. So when you get hit, you take a huge amount of damage. If you do lose a life, you will respawn where you died, but once you lose all your lives, you got to start the stage from the beginning. You can take multiple routes through the stages by picking different doors. So I usually try to take the shortest route. Not because I'm trying to make the timer, just because the less rooms I have to deal with, the better. I was just going straight for beating the game, and that was it. And, I wanted to wait to beat the game before I reviewed it. In the past, I had beaten all the stages when I was young, but aside from 2 of the stages, since it had passwords, I skipped 2 of the stages. So I didn't really consider that legit, so this time I went back and I beat all the stages from the beginning, and I made a tutorial on it. But it's not real in-depth because it's not a game I mastered. But, basically the key to mastery is mostly about spamming the special moves that I mentioned. So it's very cheap. I just find that the enemies tend to take way too many hits. It's a lot of the same enemies. You don't get a ton of variety in the enemies you have to fight. Normally you fight the same type of groups of enemies at the same time. It's usually not a mix of different types of enemies, really. There are a few parts where it does mix up the enemy types at once, but a lot of times, here I'm fighting 2 blobs at the same time. Usually you'll be fighting 2 or 3 of the same type of enemies at the same time. Now, this is a common thing in a lot of beat-em-ups, but it's just, I don't know, I find the game to be very irritating. You'll see I'm comboing these guys, and kind of randomly he breaks through and does half of my health bar is gone from that little hit I took. And of course I get knocked back onto the ground, which is just extremely irritating. And you can see there's not a ton of enemy variety. There is a decent little amount of enemies, but it's really not a lot. And, the main issue is just that the combat just feels kind of sluggish. There's a slidey control to your movement, so when you're walking, you kind of feel like you're sliding along the ground. It just feels kind of like, a little bit delayed, a little bit slippery. It just doesn't feel great. And, I would have been able to forgive some of those issues with the control, but it's just that the game itself is just very irritating to play, and it just feels inconsistent to me. The bosses are all very irritating to deal with. They just constantly do hit-and-run tactics where you try to catch them. And you may try to hit them with a jump kick, which does very little damage. So the boss fights can go on for several minutes of just trying to land jump kicks. Now, later I found the best way to deal with the bosses seems to be to try to grab most of them and fucking choke the shit out of them. Seems to be the way to go. But, a lot of them can be hard to grab because they're very evasive. So here you can see me choking this enemy, and after doing about 4 choke cycles, it kills the enemy. And that's all you really have to do for these guys. At first they seem very hard, but once I learned this kind of just makes the encounters with these guys a joke, and it's very easy to exploit once you learn this. I figured it out, and kind of late into the game. If I would have known it earlier, I would have been exploiting that shit when these guys showed up. I probably could have done this to the first boss, because these enemies are the first boss. They're just showing up now as regular enemies, as a lot of games do. So that little bit of enemy variety that you get is just because you're fighting the first boss again as a regular enemy. But yeah, I'm really, really disappointed in this game. I remember back when I got it. And playing it again, I did not enjoy it at all. I really dreaded playing the game, and it's not because it's super difficult. I just hate when a game plays kind of shitty, and I got to force myself to sit through it. I was never in the mood to play this shit. But, once I practiced I use save and load states to practice sections of the stages. Once I spent a little time doing that, I was able to easily beat the semifinal stage, and then the final boss is a joke. It's super easy. The final boss counts as its own separate stage. So, once you beat this stage, which is the semifinal stage, you will be on the last boss, which is very easy because you have all your lives to deal with just the final boss. And it's just a matter of grabbing and choking the final boss, basically, until it dies. It's very easy to deal with. This is an irritating boss because he just takes so many hits to kill. So it can be a very irritating fight. He's very hard to grab, so I had to stick to mostly landing jump kicks on him, which just takes super long with this guy. It's just a very tedious fight. But as is most of the game, you have enemies that will go off screen and just kind of linger off screen and waste your time. Which, if you're trying to make good time, is a huge pain in the ass. But even if you're just trying to play the game normally, you don't really want to sit around and wait for a fucking enemy to come back so you can fight him again. They like to keep going into the edge of the screen to where you can't get them since you can't scroll the screen to catch up with them. So there's a lot of that kind of shit. Just this irritating shit throughout the entire game. With getting knocked down constantly. It's a very limited move set. Aside from your basic jump kick, strikes, and grapples, there's really not a lot to the moves, which, a lot of old beat-em-ups were like that, and they were still very good, but this is not one of them. And like I said, it really encourages you to spam the shit out of those special moves and really not use any of the other moves in the game because they're so overpowered that's really the way, especially if you want to make the timer and get the good ending, you will be spamming the shit out of that. So at this point, this is the final boss fight. And I usually like to show the final boss fights in a lot of my reviews just to kind of give a complete view of the game. But yeah, very easy. All you really have to do is just keep walking towards the boss and, move up or down when you're above or below him to kind of grab him and just choke the shit out of him. The choke is one of the most powerful moves aside from abusing specials. But if you're not going to use the specials, because they're hard to do consistently, if you're not going to use them, then just you're going to be choking a lot of single enemies to do the most damage. Now, it's hard to choke enemies out when there's multiple enemies on the screen, but with this, you just have to worry about one guy, so it's very easy, final boss. Now, I'll say the graphics, the visuals of the game, the music is all top-notch. The art style, it's some of the best on the Genesis, I think. I really like the art style, and the music, the atmosphere, all that. It's up there with the other Splatterhouse games. It doesn't really falter in that area. But unfortunately, the gameplay is pretty shitty. So, this was a game I really didn't like. I can also see, if you can adjust to some of the mechanics, I can see why people would still enjoy the game because of the atmosphere and the visuals and stuff like that. But I just think the gameplay is pretty shitty. I mean, when you compare this to other beat-em-ups that this is trying to imitate, it's nowhere close to something like Streets of Rage series. And it didn't have to be at that level, because it has a great art style and it could have just been a solid beat-em-up and I would have enjoyed the game so much more. But I got to rate it on the gameplay. So for me, I'm going to give the game a 4 out of 10. I think it's below mediocre because of the gameplay. If you have any questions, let me know, and thanks for watching.